who was directing Cecil Rhodes? Who was running cover for Cecil Rhodes and Alfred Milner? Because they weren't operated, they didn't just start. Somebody got them in the business. And we need to go back to the beginning of this research, which was who owns this coronavirus. And one of our folks went and looked at the patent office, and it was easy to find this coronavirus is owned by the British Pirbright Institute. And of course, none of us had heard of it. In fact, we haven't focused on viruses and vaccines at all in any of our research over the last 7, 8, 9 years. So we took some time to look at it, and the Pirbright Institute, it's called, has a nefarious history, which is all tied up in the British government and, as you said, in its early experiments in germ warfare and chemical warfare. And the development of vaccines through the Burroughs Wellcome company, Henry Wellcome. So the time frame we're talking about, when it now is very clear, a lot of the current attempts by the new British Empire, I'll call it, to continue developing a British control of the world along with America. It happened in the 1880s forward, and a lot of things got going right then. And it was puzzling how these people were able to operate down in South Africa and in the U.S. and in their relations with the British Empire of the world without knowing who in Parliament was really providing them cover. And so the Pirbright Institute came up. So we just started looking, where is this? It's about 7 miles from Guildford, which is it's a bedroom community of West London. And it's a very nice area. I've booked Christian music concerts in that area many times. And it's very pretty to drive through. And then stuck on an estate just south of the little village of Pirbright, and it is truly a little village, is the Pirbright Institute. And it's this very large facility, which you can see from satellites, many buildings. You go on their website, and they boast of having funding from the likes of Bill and Melinda Gates, the Wellcome Trust, which, by the way, those are the two largest foundations providing grants on the planet. Bill Gates Foundation is number one, and the Wellcome Trust is number two. And then you go down their list on their documents, and you see the European Commission, you see that's the EU, you see the World Health Organization, and on and on. So there's a lot of money and influence in that Pirbright Institute. So we said, well, why did they name it Pirbright? And to cut a long story short, they named it Pirbright after the first Lord Pirbright, who became a baron, and he was given that title by Queen Victoria. And he has two actual names, and I'll just go with the second one. His name is Henry de Worms, first Baron Pirbright. That's his full name that's on most histories. And as we dug deeper into this Pirbright person, there's a couple of angles we can go here, but let me just stick on the family. Henry de Worms is married to a Rothschild, and he is the great-grandson of Amschel Rothschild, who started the Rothschild banking dynasty. So he is obviously a very connected individual, and we've learned further that when he was a young man, he lived in Ceylon with his father, Solomon, as you said, on the Rothschild estate. The Rothschild connection is on his mom's side, by the way. And they traded tea, coffee, and no doubt spices for the British East India Company, who the Rothschilds are well known to have funded for hundreds of years. So he comes back to England, and he was given Austrian titles. He and his family were given Austrian titles, which Queen Victoria recognized, and so therefore he became an immediate peer of the British realm. And he must have been a good speaker, because in the 1880s he was a member of Parliament from 86 to 92, and during that time he was the Minister of Trade, which is one of the most powerful positions in the British Parliament, in the British Cabinet. And then he was the Minister for the Colonies. So from that 86 to 92, he was a very powerful man in the UK and the British Empire. And it was exactly during that time, for example, that David Livingstone and Henry M. Stanley, the explorer that is supposed to have famously said, Mr. Livingston, I presume, he went on numerous expeditions to Africa. And on the surface, he was supposed to be looking for David Livingstone. But what we now conclude is that Stanley was a mercenary. He was a promoter, as was Pirbright. And one of their objectives was clearly to find poisons and cures in Africa, which Wellcome could then commercialize and distribute through the Wellcome laboratories. And at the same time, he was on a mission for the British East India Company to acquire the wealth of West Africa, especially the mining wealth in gold and diamonds. And he was closely teamed with the Rothschilds, because he was involved with the setup of the British South Africa Company in Parliament. And we have the actual records of the parliamentary discussions on this, where they set up a corporation called the British South Africa Company, which Rhodes was the leader, at the same time as N.M. Rothschild, another great-grandson, along with Baron Pirbright, funded the De Beers Diamond and Mining and Gold Company, and that became one of the chief funders of this British South Africa Corporation. And one of the most interesting aspects of this is they developed it so that it was a corporation that would run South Africa, not the British government, but this corporation. And this corporation would collect taxes, it would run its police force, and it would be independently operated. Now, that sounds very much like a fascist organization. And what we now see is that this was the origins of what we're going to call British imperial fascist corporatism. I know that's a lot of words. British imperial meaning under the Queen. Fascist corporatism means the Queen is going to give special, Queen or King, give special positions to these corporations as long as they pay their fealty to the monarch and pay their taxes. And so at every point when members of Parliament tried to question this arrangement, they were shut down. And it was Henry de Worms, first Baron Pirbright, that led the suppression of any criticism of this new British South Africa Company, which the Rothschilds were also invested in. So here we've got Henry Wellcome collecting drugs to be sent back to the UK, and Wellcome has got a facility through the trust on the Pirbright property. And in addition to that, the explorer Stanley has a tomb, memorial, monument at the Pirbright Church. So clearly, Baron Pirbright, or Lord Pirbright as he was in earlier days, was their guiding light for the development of this reorganization of the British Empire around imperialist corporatism. And this explains how that British South Africa Company gained so much power in South Africa. And then we see, as Rhodes is getting older and sick, Lord Milner and John Buchan come in, and they press by the way, Pirbright promoted both Boer Wars. And in the Second Boer War, they set up a concentration camp. And as timing would have it, Douglas, we've just gotten a slew of documents from South Africa documenting the death of children in these war concentration camps, and they describe hideous treatment of these children and symptoms, which we're still getting medical people to tell us what these symptoms are. But they clearly believed they were being experimented with at the time. And these would have been those Wellcome medicine chests. So Henry Wellcome and the whole idea of using vaccines as a bioweapon goes way back to the late 1800s, early 1900s. And Henry Wellcome, and isn't it interesting that his trust would be the largest trust, second largest trust in the world today, giving grants out to researchers to further refine this strategy. Now that I'm just going to stop there for a minute because there's some other angles here.
Well, I don't know why you're stopping because this is so good. It's riveting to hear this, and I'll just underscore a few things you were saying. Basically, you are describing the weaponization of corporate big pharmaceutical.
Yes.
And
no question at all.
Yeah, it's like shocking that they are so blatant about it, and that they will say, "Oh no, we have patents." They brag about their patents. You can find this on their website. When you read these things, you can hardly believe them. And now, myself, I keep being embarrassed again and again to say that I actually have a degree in history, and I did not know that the Viennese Habsburg court Jew, Solomon de Worms, was given Ceylon as just an experimental place to show us how far he could fleece basically an entire island, or one could even say a nation. So these were the archetypal corporatizations of what we had seen with the British East India Company, the Dutch East India Company, the German Hanseatic League, and then what you just described as the South Africa
British South Africa
Corporation, which we know we had ran across them when we were looking at Cecil Rhodes and then Milner and the Transvaal, and the way that they were ripping off the gold and the diamonds and being supported monetarily by Rothschilds and being given fake propaganda, because remember, this is also directly connected to fake propaganda because the Kinetics is connected to BBC, and they basically control the airwaves. In a minute, I'm going to make a crazy speculation for anybody, which you'll have to be very much a follower of us to understand this. But once I say this and you think about it, I would like to see if anybody can say that it isn't true. But anyway, let's go back.
Well, let me add another layer here because it's really important. In the 80s, in the 1880s, was the period of time when Nikola Tesla was filing all of his many patents for his inventions for wireless, for electric light, for electric motor, for wireless telegraphs. And we counted up during the tenure of Lord Pirbright as the Minister of Trade in the colonies, Tesla had filed 56 patents. And we already knew from previous research that this was exactly the same time that the British Post Office and Admiralty were setting up Marconi as a cutout, as a front man for a Marconi wireless company that the British were going to have a monopoly on. And they were going to give a monopoly contract to the Post Office and to the Admiralty, which would be rock solid. Now, how do we know this? Well, there's a lot of evidence for it now, and there's a lot of discussion in Parliament about these contracts. They entered them in secret in the 1880s during de Worms's tenure, and we also know that they very much saw that the telegraphy business allowed them to better unify their communications throughout the empire, and that as wireless came on, these guys were not stupid. They saw that they wanted to have a monopoly on wireless technology throughout the world, and that's what they worked to achieve. And so when they took Marconi public in a Marconi wireless public in about 1910, 1911, 1912, David Lloyd George, the future prime minister, had conducted insider trading and had gone and bought stock in American Wireless, Marconi Wireless, and got caught. And they actually call it the Marconi scandal.